Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to introduce you tonight to a really interesting gentleman, author. David Moscrop is his name. He's a columnist, he's a podcaster, and he's the author of a book that just sounds really fascinating to me. Too Dumb for Democracy: Why We Make Bad Political Decisions and How We Can Make Better Ones. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Globe and Mail, the Guardian, and elsewhere. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia. He lives in Ottawa. David, welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. So tell me, what is this book, Too Dumb for Democracy, about?
Well, it's a little book that could, it was out in 2019 and it's still going. We've just secured a deal to do an audiobook and to move into the United States. And I got to tell you, you will never go broke betting against democracy. It is a long-term investment. And the book is a little bit of a lamentation about that fact. The central premise is that we aren't incapable of making good political decisions. We aren't incapable of self-government, but we've set ourselves up in such a way that we behave as if we are. So we end up making terrible decisions, irrational decisions, emotional decisions, decisions based on bad information, poor information, based on lies that we make to ourselves and to others. And the book is a sort of tracing of how that happens and a little bit of an account of how we can do better, because we can do better. But, the world is sort of stacked against us when it comes to trying to do that.
How do you think we can do better?
Well, there's a bunch of ways. Say we decided to get very serious about making good political decisions, sort of rational political decisions, consistent political decisions based on good information. We not just as individuals, but as a society, we could do that. We could say, look, we're going to make, political decision-making part of our lives. Not every single day, all day. I don't want to be a professional citizen. Most people don't. I get that. But we could say we're going to make this a bigger part of our lives. So government's going to spend more time bringing people into the political decision-making process. They're actually going to listen to people, give them resources, give them time. Then we say, okay, well, fine. We also want to train ourselves in a small way to recognize the sort of gremlins that crawl into our brain when we are making political decisions. Are we relying on good information? Are we emotional and angry or frustrated or vindictive right now in such a way that's going to produce bad decisions that have nothing to do with good outcomes? We could do that as well. We could make sure that people had enough basic resources so that they could dedicate time to this. And we could get serious about trying to create an online environment that wasn't so toxic and counterproductive. We could do all that stuff if we really wanted to. It's entirely possible. But asking someone to make a good political decision without preparing or training is a bit like asking somebody to hit a fastball without preparing or training. And if you've ever tried to hit a fastball, as people say, it's one of the hardest things to do in sports. Right? It's very hard to hit a fastball, but you can be trained to do it. And in the same way, you can be trained to make better political decisions.
It sounds, David, almost as if what you're describing is like unbelievably unrealistic and idealistic. Aren't most of our political leaders today doing the exact opposite of what you're describing as the education or the training that we need to get to be able to hit a fastball? It's almost as if they're catering to victimhood, to anger, to fear, to all the issues that make people just want to listen to an echo chamber and decide without really thinking about it.
Yes, that's absolutely right. That's exactly what's happening. And the way I put it is, if you were to custom design an environment hostile to good political decision making, it would look exactly like ours. We've basically custom designed an environment for that. So the program I'm suggesting is in that sense, unlikely and utopian, but it's what we call a kind of regulative ideal. So it's basically, saying, look, if we could do everything well and everything right, this is what it would look like. Now let's start here and work back and talk about what we can actually do to make things better, because we're never going to have a utopia, but my God, we can certainly do better than this. And we have to. And one of the conclusions I come to is we could introduce into Canada a practice that's very common around the world, including here from time to time, called citizens' assemblies or participatory budgeting. These are democratic institutions that bring ordinary people together in particular circumstances and yield very good results. citizen-driven results. And what the reason they work is that they are sort of protected spaces where people are given time, access to experts, and resources to sit down and think about things in an environment where they aren't encouraged to sling mud at one another or to try to one-up one another on their own pet problems, or respond to strategic concerns like money or partisanship or whatever. And when we bring people together in those circumstances, they actually produce really, really good results. And that's used around the world. There's a permanent one in Belgium now, for instance. It was used here in Canada, in Ontario and in British Columbia when we were trying to decide on electoral reform. Cities have participatory budgeting pilot projects around the country. This stuff works. My argument is we need to do more of it, and we need to push politicians to listen to the outcomes of these things, to take a little bit of the power back from them and give a little bit more back to day-to-day folks who know exactly what they want when you give them the chance to think about it.
So I participated in some citizen budget meetings. The population skewed very old, was almost completely homeowners, was people that were in the community for a long period of time. And in the two that I'm thinking of, in a community where over 50% of the people have been in Canada for less than 10 years, I don't think there was one face that was not white in the whole crowd. I've appeared recently at some community meetings on development projects, and similarly, older, more homeowners, more white, and established in their interests, and none of them led to really good discussions.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is
all sort of NIMBYism.
Yeah, well, this is the heart of the matter, is you've got to get the constitution of these things right off the top. And one of the points I try to make in the book, and when I write about this more generally, is these are very good institutions, but they're only as good as the way you design them. And so with citizens assemblies, what you try to do is you design them through sortition, through sort of random lottery. But the way you design the lottery is such that you make sure that you have a more or less random sample that is going to produce a population of folks that represent the community at large. And you can control from that for that on the back end and say, okay, fine, we've got all these folks in the pool, but we're going to make sure that there are non-homeowners. We're going to make sure that there are younger people. We're going to make sure that there are, second generation folks, whatever it may be. And that way you get those people represented. The thing about, say, community meetings is you can never control for that, because at a community meeting, it's sort of whoever shows up, right? Whoever puts their hand up, whoever talks the loudest, and those become often an absolute gong show, right? They're really one of the people think about democracy, they think of these town halls, but town halls are pretty wretched things.
But those are the people that are interested. Those are the people that are educated. Those are the people that not educated necessarily from a PhD in political science standpoint, but from a knowledgeable about the topic because they've gone out and had interest in research the topic. So those are the people that have got a point of view. If you just do a random sampling, you're going to get people that have no idea what you're talking about and no interest.
You do, but one of the things they found that is pretty common about most CAs is that when you bring folks together, now you have to, they opt into it, right? You're chosen at random, but if you don't want to go, nobody comes and sort of drags you in and says, okay, this is what you're doing now. It sort of defeats the democratic purpose. But you're right, is if it's a self-selecting thing on its own, it becomes a group of people who are just interested in it and know something about it ahead of time. But if you make it random and then allow folks to opt out, one of the things you find is that people show up, they may be semi-interested in something, they may not know anything about it at all, but they learn very, very quickly because they have access to experts. I had and one another. And I had a colleague, Michael McKenzie, who wrote on salmon genomics and citizens assemblies. Now, nobody knows anything about salmon genomics off the street. Nobody.
Something about salmon? They're a fish, right?
Yeah, exactly. They spawn. I think they go upriver, and that might not actually be true. I have no idea. But these regular folks came together to study salmon genomics and became competent enough to make decisions about salmon genomic policy. They didn't become scientists, but they became competent enough to make public decisions about policy regarding salmon genomics fairly quickly because, again, they had access to people they could talk to. And this is the core thing at the end of the day is people may not be experts in everything, but as one or historian David Raybrook put it, Van Raybrook, people are experts in their own lives. And they have the capacity to decide for themselves what they think is good or bad when you give them the time and the right setting to do so. And so, this can be done, and it can be done on complicated topics. Electoral reform is a good example. If you go back and talk to the people who participated in the citizens' assemblies on electoral reform in British Columbia and Ontario quite a while ago now, at the early part of the 2000s, they didn't really know a ton about it, and it was new to a lot of people, but they came to become experts of a sort in what the best sort of electoral reform might be. And we could do that for all kinds of things. We just got to want to. But the fundamental problem here, I think the fundamental blockage, is that politicians don't really want this. They don't love the idea because they don't want to give up the power to other people.
Well, don't we have a thing we call representative democracy? Aren't our politicians supposed to do exactly what you're saying the citizen assembly should be doing? They should be representing the views of their constituents, no?
Oh, they absolutely should. And sometimes they do. When we get lucky, they do. But often they don't, for different reasons. They have sort of strategic partisan reasons. They have, the influence of lobbyists who effectively get paid quite a bit of money and become, not all of them, but some of them get paid quite a bit of money, but they become experts in trying to convince government and politicians on the other side, across the aisle, to do this or that. And they are professional arguers and are very, very good at it. Citizens have a lot less capacity to influence their representatives that way. So you end up getting skewed results, right? That a sort of professional class of lobbyists who tend to shape more of the agenda, the professional class of party folks who shape more of the agenda than people. And I don't want to do away with representative democracy for the simple reason that who's got the time? We don't. This isn't ancient Athens, right? We couldn't possibly reconstitute a fully participatory democracy, which, by the way, was never fully participatory because it was only about 10% of the population who actually was able to participate in government. Sort of, native-born Athenians who were men. So we were never going to get there. But we can say we want to counterbalance representative democracy a little bit with more of a participation from folks, from day-to-day folks, who can help set the agenda by saying, here are the things we really, really care about, and who can help get, from time to time, decisions that they want that are in their best interest. Because as a thought experiment, let's just say, for instance, that we did away with representative democracy tomorrow, and we chose our legislature through random lottery, and it was just day-to-day people who ended up in the legislature. Would the political agenda of the day and the decisions that emerged look different than the ones we have in the current legislature? And I think the answer is they would. And if that's true, then we say, well, maybe there's a bit of a gap in representative democracy between what the representatives want for us and what we want for ourselves. Maybe we can close that a little bit by bringing more people into the political process and giving them their chance to say, here's what I want, and here's how I want to do it. And closing that gap even a little bit, I think would go a long way to producing better policy for people.
Fascinating. We're chatting tonight with David Moscrop. He's a freelance writer, an author, a podcaster, a researcher, and he's written this really interesting book about politics and democracy. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes. And I ask David about some of the issues that he's addressed in the past couple of months and how that relates to his book. And then we're also going to delve into some of his challenges to our current political democratic system. Stay with us, everyone. This is going to be an interesting conversation tonight. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having an interesting conversation tonight with David Moscrop. He is a freelance writer, an author, a podcaster, a researcher. He's got a PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia, and he studied psychology of decision-making and how digital media affects our behavior. And I think that is something that has dramatically changed the way that we think from a political standpoint in our democracies in Canada, the United States, around the world in the last couple of years dramatically. So I want to delve into that a little bit. He's written a book that I think is kind of interesting. Too Dumb for Democracy: Why We Make Bad Political Decisions and How We Can Make Better Ones. was released in 2019, and he's just about to release his audio version, which I'm looking forward to. He's got a really fascinating background. As I mentioned, he's got a master's in political science, and a PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia. He's worked as a researcher at Simon Fraser University at the University of British Columbia. He was a teacher, a head teacher, teaching Korean students in English, which sounds like it was an interesting experience. He's been a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ottawa in the Department of Communication, a contributing columnist at the Washington Post, the host of Open to Debate, which we'll talk about a little bit. And he's been a freelance writer for the last couple of years. David, thanks again for joining us. The reason why I think I originally reached out to you was you wrote that you thought that the issue in Quebec, where we closed the border to migrants, was actually going to end up being a negative. Tell us about that piece and what your conclusion was, if you could.
Yeah, so I've just recently started writing with G0 Media. They're part of the Eurasia Group, and that was the first piece I wrote for them. And it's part of a new North American vertical that they have for a newsletter for folks on North American relationship between the United States, Canada, and perhaps Mexico. And this happened right when the Roxham Road issue was hitting its apogee, and people were have been concerned about it for some time. But Joe Biden was coming to town, and so Ottawa was sort of stealing itself for the traffic, and everyone else was saying, okay, well, what are we going to get from this? And the Liberal Party, the Liberal government, I should say, had a problem, which is that they didn't want to simply turn people away because they're supposed to be the nice, welcoming Liberal government. And yet in Quebec, so many people were crossing at Roxham, tens of thousands of people on a regular border crossing, that the Premier Legault said, we can't possibly process and integrate this many people. And to his credit, that's an awful lot of people to cross the border irregularly. And it indicates a pretty big problem, is that when people cross, you have to be able to welcome these people to the country. We need, if we're going to do immigration, which I think we should do, if we're going to do lots of immigration, which I think we should do, we need to be able to make sure that people can get jobs, that they can integrate into communities, that they can find shelter, which is becoming increasingly impossible for everyone in this country, and so on. So it's a big issue. But the way that this went down is they sort of struck a deal and announced it out of nowhere because they didn't want to tip off anybody, because they didn't want to rush to the Roxham irregular crossing or any other irregular crossing. So they out of nowhere said, okay, this thing is closed. And from now on, if you try to cross at a non-official border crossing, you're going to be arrested. And if or apprehended, I should say. And if we catch you within 14 days of you crossing, we're sending you back to the United States. And then that's their problem. Incidentally, if you last more than the 14 days, it's like the Hunger Games. You can appeal to the review board to stay. So my argument was, well, and this was what I heard from talking to experts, well, what's going to happen now is people are just going to go underground. They're not going to stop coming because they're desperate. They're just going to go to increasingly risky lengths to get across the border and rely on increasingly dodgy people to get them across the border. And it might reduce the numbers a little bit, but it's going to produce a lot more harm too.
So what's the solution?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the solution is in taking more people at official points where they can be properly processed, documented, and taken care of, and including refugee claimants. And the core of the matter, though, is the Safe Third Country Agreement that sort of says, well, look, if you're going to claim asylum, you've got to do it in the safe country that you land in. So you can't really kind of like go shop around, right? So if you land in the United States, you can't then try to come claim asylum in Canada. Part of the problem, though, and this is what led to this change, was the agreement was made in the early 2000s, but for whatever reason, and I never got a good answer as to why, they didn't cover irregular border crossings. They didn't conceive of it, maybe, or they didn't want to deal with a thorny issue. So the Safe Third Country Agreement didn't apply to these irregular crossings, which is why everyone flocked to them. So you go to the non-official border crossings, and it didn't apply, but it applied at all the official ports of entry. And so, in a sense, to be sort of charitable to the government, of the United States and Canada, they thought of this as closing a loophole in the agreement that should have been covered in 2004 but wasn't. And fair enough. I mean, it's bizarre that they didn't cover it. But the answer, and the government under this current plan is going to take more people than it was previously, but not nearly enough, because the people are coming. And they're coming because they're fleeing wretched governments and collapsing states. And we've got to find a way to integrate those folks, both in Canada and the United States, because the alternative is that they suffer and maybe die.
So you're saying the solution is a better process at the official border crossings. Isn't the challenge there that official process is long? It's quasi, if not completely judicial. The people are almost treated like criminals. They're not treated like refugees or immigrants. You know, the image that you have of my forefathers coming to Canada, who knows whether they were illegal or legal, 200 years ago, was that they were greeted and given free land. That's sort of the opposite today.
Well, it very much is the opposite. Although it's worth noting that then, as in now, one of the core drivers of accepting people was labor. I mean, one of the things that's been constant for the history of this entire country, as it's been a country, is that you get the land, but you're expected to work it. And today, the immigration program is largely the same. Is that look, whether this is expressly said or tacitly accepted, it's true. Canada's birth rate is below the rate of replacement, and the way that we keep things growing and the economy going is immigration. And that's part of the reason the Liberal government raised the immigration target in recent months to something like 400,000 or 500,000 people a year. And it's just to make sure that process is ongoing. But of course, there's a difference between, say, economic migrants, and those are the folks who are primarily we rely on for that growth, and refugees. And part of the critique from the migrant advocates and experts is that the government is very, very concerned about economic migrants because it's good for business, but they're not so concerned about refugees. And so we need to be putting more resources into refugee programs, both public and private, because again, a lot of people I talk to say Canada pioneered the private refugee sponsorship program, and that's fine. Individuals can sponsor refugees. They can put their own resources, private resources towards that, and we can bring more folks in that way. That's great, but we need more state-based, support for these folks too. It can't just fall onto the shoulders of the private community, which will never meet the need. But not to be cynical about it, but to turn it back around on the sort of the core lens the government uses to think about migration. Refugees end up becoming a part of this country in a way that is more often than not extraordinarily productive too. Right. So it ends up being a great net positive for the country. But to go back to an earlier point I made, we've got to be able to process folks in and integrate people into the country and the community. And that requires resources too. And I'll close off on this point. One of the big problems about that is that responsibility isn't primarily a federal responsibility. It falls provincially and locally. So we end up with a massive coordination problem across levels of government, which is the nature of this country, right? All our problems sort of stem from the fact that we've got 3 levels of government who don't always play so well together in the sandbox.
Well, I was fascinated by that one line in the report on the inquiry into the Emergency Measures Act, where the judge said that there was a failure of democracy or failure of politics because of exactly that the municipal, provincial, and federal, and primarily I think the provincial and federal governments weren't working together. But let's come back to this issue that you raised, that we have this. I would wonder if it's a bias against migrants in favor of economic immigrants in our immigration system. And maybe this is completely irrelevant, but on both sides of my family, they were refugees. I had one set of refugees that came from the United States in the War of Independence, and they came from Philadelphia. They were tarred feather. They were stayed loyal to the king at the time, and they were sent packing from Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and came to southwestern Ontario and were given free land. and were deemed United Empire loyalists. Almost 100 years later, maybe 75 years later, I had refugees come from Scotland and Ireland during famines, and they were escaping, failed government systems and incredible, agricultural challenges, starvation and famine. And isn't that sort of the history of Canada and, frankly, the United States? So why do we have a bias against that today?
Well, I think part of it is I've got mine, and then we close the doors to everyone else, despite the fact that the country was founded on not just migration from elsewhere, but colonialism from coming in and quite literally stealing land and occupying it. So it's a bit rich often, I'd say, for us to sort of turn around and say, well, the door's closed now. We're all here, but we're going to close the door. And yet, though, this is something I'm grappling with an awful lot as someone on the left. We also have to take seriously the fact that a lot of people are struggling and are in deep and trying to get through the day, and they can't afford their rent or their mortgage or the groceries, and they are concerned about their own survival. And one of the things we have to figure out and communicate is that the people who are coming to this country aren't your competition, and they're not your enemy. They're in the same struggle that you are. And by the way, they've got it worse. The folks who are dying trying to get across the border here have it worse, objectively, even if you've got it bad. But it's not about suffering Olympics. That's not what I wanted. We don't need to make it the oppression Olympics. But the point is that we ought to have some solidarity here, and we ought to say, okay, well then the core is, how do we then build a system, a welfare state, an economic system in which we can integrate folks, in which they are paid sufficiently, in which we have healthcare to support them, in which we have affordable care, in which we're not getting ripped off at the grocery store, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they start looking around and saying, okay, so the people we should be who are antagonistic here aren't refugees and working class folks. It's people who own mega corporations and the state. Those are the ones we ought to be looking to and saying, okay, we want a better deal. And I think when we start shifting the lens away from this antagonism between people at the bottom or in the middle of the ladder towards those who are at the top, we can start talking more productively about better outcomes. But I don't know, we've sort of been trained to look at one another towards the bottom and see that person as the competition as the enemy, getting one more rung up the ladder. Meanwhile, there's people 400, 500 rungs up the ladder we think of as having nothing to do with us.
We're chatting tonight with David Moscrop. He is a freelance writer. He's an author. He's a podcaster. He's a researcher. He's written a fascinating book about the challenges with democracy. If people want to read your book, how do they go get a copy of your book, sir?
Well, they can get it pretty much everywhere. You can get it Indigo, you can get it on Amazon, you can soon get it on Audible and elsewhere as an audiobook. But I always sort of love it when folks can find it at their local independent bookshop. There's nothing I like better than popping into a local shop on the weekend, have a coffee, go look through some books, and they're struggling independent sellers. So if there's an independent seller in your community, I highly recommend you check out that spot. They can get a copy for you for sure. But let's be honest, we're all trying to get through the day, and some days you just pop onto Amazon and want something the next day.
Remind us the name, sir.
Too Dumb for Democracy, ? I love the way you pronounced it earlier, because you emphasize that question mark, which is really important, because without the question mark, the book becomes awfully patronizing. But it's Too Dumb for Democracy, ? Why we make bad political decisions and how we can make better ones. And it's available everywhere fine books are sold.
We're going to take a break. We'll be back in 2 minutes with David Moscrop. Stay with us, everyone. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is David Moscrop. He's a columnist, he's a podcaster, and he's an author of a book, Too Dumb for Democracy? Why We Make Bad Political Decisions and How We Can Make Better Ones. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Globe and Mail, the Guardian, and elsewhere. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia, and he's coming to us tonight from Ottawa. David, I noticed that you wrote another really interesting piece, I think it was in the Washington Post, about healthcare and Premier Doug Ford's strategy for reducing wait times in emergency rooms. And it was for-profit medical care, and you're very critical of that. Tell me a little bit about your article and what you were saying.
Yeah, so one of the jobs of a columnist is to pay attention to a lot of things and then to focus in on one thing and to learn a lot about that thing in a short amount of time and to reach some conclusions. And sometimes you reach a conclusion that you think is so obvious and so common sense that you feel like you're missing something. You're like, well, this is what am I missing here? And this is what happened in this piece. So Doug Ford says we're going to open up a certain amount of the public system to for-profit surgery centers that are going to exist throughout the province. And these folks are going to exist to make a profit, unlike a hospital that's run by a board or, a university medical center or so on. Now, there are already for-profit elements in our system. Your family doctor, probably a for-profit corporation run by a doctor or two. But the concern with the surgery center model is that we're going to get kind of like, no-name surgery centers. They're going to have these big chain surgery centers that open, and there's going to be a whole bunch of them, and their goal is to maximize profit. And they do that by moving people through the system really carefully, through trying to upsell you to get you to buy, things you don't need, and so on and so forth, which, by the way, a recent study has found is happening in this country. And so the concern is, or they're going to provide subpar care or some mix of those things. And the moment where I was like, what am I missing here is I was talking to someone who said, we should open up community surgery centers that specialize in very particular kinds of surgeries, hip replacements, for instance, knee replacements, whatever it might be. But they should be extensions of hospitals, and they should be run under the not-for-profit system. Because as soon as you introduce a profit element into care, you risk reducing the quality of care as people try to process you like they would process you at I'm trying to think of, a corporate outlet where you're processed really quickly at a McDonald's, in and out as fast as possible. And I was like, well, right. Why wouldn't the government just invest in more of these community surgery centers that are run by hospitals, which already exist? You have the same outcome, more community surgery centers. The answer is a mix of, well, it's capital intensive at the outset. It costs a lot of money to build these things. And two, they don't make money. They don't for profit. And so you start looking at the government saying, well, maybe they want for-profit care, more for-profit care in the system. And that doesn't mean you're paying out of pocket to go get the surgery necessarily, but you might have to pay for upgrades. But it does mean that you risk getting worse care and that bits of the system are sold off to private corporations. And that has a lot of people worried, and especially when there are other solutions to these problems.
So I went and had a hernia operation done at Shouldice, which is a not-for-profit, but it's a non-government owned entity that provides hernia surgeries in Ontario and Toronto. And it's reputed to be one of the best in the world if you've got a hernia, because all they do is hernias. They get very good at it. They get very fast at it. And one of the things that they believe is that, you walk off of the operating table and you're out that day or maybe the next day, and the outcomes are far better. What is it about profit, or what is it that you've got against profit? Profit, the capitalist system does, we believe, we think, have incentives for efficiency, for productivity, for higher quality, et cetera, because you're going to make more money if you do those things. Why is it that you, by definition, believe that a for-profit oriented center is actually going to be less quality care as they strive to make a profit? Our capitalist system would suggest that really what it's going to do is it's going to want higher quality, yes, more efficiency, more productivity, and it's going to want a very good reputation for being the best place to go, because otherwise it's going to be damaging to its profit.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing is if you have a small market controlled by a handful of operations, the market signals don't work as well because people don't have anywhere else to go. And with things like, surgery centers, which are extraordinarily capital intensive, only a handful of players can actually enter the market. So the market signals, even on capitalism's own metrics, sort of fall down. Sort of saying like, well, if you don't like McDonald's, you can start another mega chain. And, people do, and the handful of chains do pop up. But the fact is the market remains dominated by a handful of owners. Ditto groceries. You might say, well, if you don't like Loblaws, you don't like Sobeys, go start your own grocery chain. But the fact is, these chains are massive and they crowd out everyone else. And so for a lot of people, the functional choice you have is Loblaws or Sobeys, right? So you end up being pushed into those. So the signals, the market signals don't quite work. And I guess I would say, what's the best model for what we expect the surgeries to look like? And I would say, look to your local chain of health clinic and tell me about your experience there. And do you want that to be the model for surgeries? And I think the answer would be no, because we all at these chain, if anyone who's been to one of these chain clinics, know the service is awful and often incompetent. And not something you would probably want to replicate. So the thing is, okay, well then we could still have the efficiency of a specialized clinic like Shouldice, but it would be in a not-for-profit system, and you get the efficiency without the sort of troubling incentives of trying to cut costs or upsell, which are the two real concerns. And that seems like the best of both worlds, because I do think the profit motive obviously drives a lot of good outcomes and does indeed, in many cases, drive innovation, but not in every industry. And so I think when we're looking at the marketplace, it's worth sort of disaggregating and saying, where do these principles hold up and where do they start to break down? And on a lot of public goods, they start to break down pretty fast. And then we can say, okay, well, maybe we need a different model. And by the way, I should add real quickly, there are other things we can do too. I mean, I remember talking to doctors who were saying, yeah, we got to get these surgeries up. We got to get these community clinics up. But we also have to do things like recognize foreign credentials more quickly and more competently. It's absolutely absurd that we have people from around the world coming here driving Ubers when they could be operating on you or caring for you as a nurse or whatever. So that's another thing we got to do. And we have like another aha moment where I'm like, this is so obvious. Why aren't we doing this? Was centralized intake for referrals, which we have in some cases, but we don't have a central system because the system is so decentralized, where you'd say, okay, well, this person needs to go get an MRI, or this person needs to go get a CT scan, or they need to see a gastroenterologist, a gastro doctor. This is not my area of specialty. And what we're going to do is put all the names into a central intake, and then we're going to triage them and apportion them out accordingly, instead of sending faxes. In some cases, my God, they still use faxes to a place that a few days later says, oh no, there's no appointments, go somewhere else, right? It's utterly incoherent. So there are modernization bits we could do too that would go a long way into fixing the system, but it would not sell it out to change that will ultimately, I don't think, serve us particularly well. But I will close on this point. I do have to say, some critics of the changes sort of said, well, this is American medicine and you're going to be paying out of pocket. And I think when we talk about this stuff, we should be honest and fair enough to say what it is. And that's not what it is, right? There may be a risk of upselling in some cases, and we should be worried about that. But it's not like you're going to go take your credit card out at the clinic and have to pay for their surgery, right? This is still fundamentally funded under the public system. It's just privately delivered.
And I do think that that's an important distinction that you make. And I'm a firm believer in the one payer system, our healthcare insurance system. But I have no difficulty with private delivery, whether it be a doctor that's a private business providing his services, or frankly, the Shouldice Hospital or other surgery centers. You point out in your article that I think that your average wait time in emergencies was 22 and a half hours. I had that experience recently. I had to go for a broken bone after a car accident, and I phoned 3 different places, and none of them would take me directly into the fracture clinic, even though I had already gone to an emergency room. They all told me I had to go to the emergency room first to then get referred to their fracture clinic. Each one of the 3 hospitals I called had a different time. And finally, one person said, come at 6 a.m. in the morning. Don't come at midnight. Don't come at 10 p.m. You'll be there, forever, but come at 6 a.m. in the morning, just as the doctors are arriving, and you'll get in real quick. I went at 6 a.m. They said, oh, you came at a great time. I didn't see someone until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Like, it was unbelievable. And then talking about the upsell, I had to pay for the parking, and I had to pay for my splint, and then I had to pay for therapy. So I don't know. It's an interesting system.
It's a mess.
you were on another interesting podcast that I saw on affordable housing in I presume Toronto, but urban areas around Canada. What do you think the solution is to our affordability crisis right now in housing?
Oh, I don't think there's any single solution. I mean, this is something I've been thinking about and talking about and researching for a long time. I lived in Vancouver for the better part of a decade when I was doing my PhD and my postdoc, and so I lived through the wretched unaffordability of Vancouver real estate, and I got lucky. But watching people struggle through that, and myself trying to find a place, was a real wake up call. I mean, I grew up in Peterborough in the 80s and 90s, and wasn't exactly an affordability crisis for rentals or ownership in Peterborough in those days. There is now, though. And so it gives you a sense of just how bad it's gotten. And I think the answer is a mix of things. One is, to the credit of a number of politicians on the left and the right, including, by the way, Pierre Poilievre, they're right to say that we've got to get rid of gatekeeping NIMBYs who resist development and who resist density. And I remember the Conservatives under Aaron O'Toole, and I think they maintained the policy, said that they were going to tie certain federal dollars to the construction of dense housing in cities. I think transit money they were going to withhold. So they said to cities, you build this stuff, you build it dense, you build it in the city, or you don't get the money. And I think that's a great idea. Cities have got to move on this. There's a supply issue there, obviously. But I don't think there's only a supply issue in the sense that it's not just a market supply issue. There's always going to be people who can't afford the market rate. And even if you look at the CMHC and what they sort of say is this is, a reasonable, this is how much you can spend of your salary on housing for it to be sustainable. It's much higher than people can actually afford. So we need non-market housing as well. We need co-ops. We need public housing. There was decades of investment in public housing in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom that was wildly successful. It was tapered off in the 1990s, and it's contributed in a big way to the housing crisis. So the fact is we need a non-market solutions as well. It works. I know Singapore is an example. Singapore is sort of always an outlier in every possible study of everything because it is an atypical place, but they made public housing work, and they made nice public housing work. Northern European states do the same thing. It can be done. So I think a mix of making sure that we can build, density, and we get cities out of the way and NIMBYs out of the way, and provide some public housing options. And incidentally, also take more seriously the idea that we need purpose-built rentals as well. That would go a long way to solving the crisis. But at the end of the day, as long as we're commodifying housing, the prices are always going to be a little bit higher than they would be otherwise, and in some cases much higher.
Well, I do think that supply is the biggest issue. I think that time for approval ends up adding in huge amounts of cost and risk, such that cost and risk ends up not being absorbed by the developer, but being passed on to the consumer, and development fees are added on to that. So I think that municipal governments have been far more of the problem than the issue. And I think that the municipal government structure of governance, and maybe we could talk about that in regards to your democracy argument, have led to NIMBYs having a far more powerful voice, a far louder voice than they otherwise would, because they control, I believe, the local councillors, and those local councillors vote in favor of the squeaky wheel. That said, I do think that the other issue that you raise, and I was told the other day that there's 6,000 people in Toronto that sleep out on the outside every night on average. 6,000 people. And, mental health is an issue. There's no question. I've got to believe that. But I don't think 6,000 people are choosing to live outside. I think they're being forced by economics to live outside. And I do think that there's a needed solution for that. And I really worry that we're going to have the Manhattanization of Toronto if we don't do something about all these issues. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with some concluding comments with David Moscrop in just 2 minutes. Fascinating conversation tonight. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is David Moscrop. He's a columnist, he's a podcaster, an author of Too Dumb for Democracy: Why We Make Bad Political Decisions and How We Can Make Better Ones. Fascinating discussion tonight, David. I really want to thank you for the discussion, not only of democracy, but of migrants, about healthcare, about affordable housing. We could probably go on for a while on different topics. It might be a lot of fun. I've given this topic a little bit of thought myself, and I always thought that proportional representation, that referendum, that recall, that term limits were all potential solutions. And then I've got a friend that I've interviewed on the show a couple of times that thinks that, it's almost a constant poll by way of an app on the telephone that is the solution. In the last provincial election in Ontario, it took 1/6 the number of votes for a Conservative than a New Democrat Party to elect an MP. And it took another 1/6 of a vote to elect an NDPer versus a Liberal. So it took 12 Liberals to elect a MPP versus one person to elect a Conservative. So a Conservative vote was 12 times more powerful than a Liberal vote because of our first past the post system, because of people getting elected with 38, 39, 40% of the vote. And I think that that's led to a lack of confidence and belief that your vote counts, and terrible turnout. And the turnout ends up being older. So people that look like me tend to vote, multiples of what people that either look like my kids or my kids with some color. So what do you think about some of those other solutions?
Oh, well, let me tell you. Incidentally, I just finished writing about proportional representation for the Globe Mail. The piece should be out any day now. And I have long been a proponent of PR. I was at the special committee in front of Parliament years ago when the government was deciding it. I was a witness in favor of PR. I wrote the Broadbent Institute report on PR, trying to advocate for that. I was part of the BC push for it as well a few years ago when I was living there. And so it's something I've been involved in and passionate about for a long time. And I think it's absolutely one of the solutions. Incidentally, I think, what they call mixed member proportional would be a great option for this country, where you have a ballot with actually 2 votes, one for a local representative like we have now, and one for a party. That would be a proportional bit that would balance out the disproportionality in the system. Germany uses it and New Zealand use it, and they're pretty good democracies. So I think PR would be great. I worry a little bit about things like referendums because they tend to be really heated snapshots of a moment where you don't necessarily get the best out of people. In fact, they can sometimes become really nasty and divisive in counterproductive ways. But part of the reason I like CAs instead of them. But I do think PR is a fundamental, essential part of democratic renewal in this country. I think it would work very, very well for us. The best democracies in the world are PR democracies. If you think of the top democracies in the world, the Northern European states, all PR. Australia is PR. New Zealand is PR. Germany is PR. Occasionally you get outliers who are less healthy democracies. Israel is an example of that right now. Italy is an example of that, sometimes Belgium, but they have very particular problems of their own, structural problems of their own, and we wouldn't use that version of PR. They use list PR that we wouldn't use here. We would use either MMP that I was talking about or a different system called STV, a single transferable vote. So I think it's absolutely a slam dunk. I also think politicians tend not to want it, especially those whose parties would be less likely to form majority governments under a new system. And I think in 2015 with the Liberals, that's what we saw. They said, Justin Trudeau said this is going to be the last election under first past the post. He wins under it, a majority. They have the committee. They go around the country. They realize that people don't want the Liberal preferred system, which is known as alternative vote, a non-PR style, but they want PR. And then the government backed off it. And so it's off the agenda federally right now. It's going to be a struggle to get it back on there, but I think it'd be a great change.
David, thank you so much for joining us. Please remind us the name of the book and where one can buy it.
The book is Too Dumb for Democracy, ? Why we make bad political decisions and how we can make better ones. You can get it wherever books are sold, but I always recommend a local independent seller. And soon it will be out in an audio version, which you can also get everywhere. And then if you happen to be in the United States in the coming year, it'll be in the United States as well.
And you're a prolific writer, columnist, etc. If people want to follow your frequent writings, how best to do that? On LinkedIn or Twitter or your website or what?
Twitter is the best right now at David_Moscrop. And as the spring starts to spring, you can also find me at the local feed stores and greenhouses as I get ready to teach myself how to plant a garden.
David Moscrop, thank you so much for joining us. That's our show for tonight, everybody. I think that David has got some really interesting points to make in regards to the failure of our democracy. As we chatted about, I happen to think proportional representation is probably one of the biggest and most important changes. We didn't have enough time to talk about term limits and recall, and I think those are also great suggestions. The citizen assembly, I just worry that that too often people aren't going to participate. And that's been my experience. And so you got to make it really easy for people to participate on a very frequent basis. And some of these apps that people have been talking about lately that sort of poll you on issues on a regular basis, they might be the solutions. Anyway, I think it's a topic because I worry that with low turnout, people are voting with their feet. They're saying, this democracy is not working. It doesn't represent me. And protest and echo chambers and conspiracy theories end up being too often the way people get their information and voice their point of view. Great conversation, David. Thanks for joining us. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Good night.